Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of our Eastern Ideologies series, which is our first history series here at TRI. My name is Jonathan and I'll be your speaker today. So as you see, we've called our first two lectures Chinese ideologies, and in this case, the ideology really isn't Chinese, so I had to put a question mark after the word Chinese. So, as usual, in every single one of our lectures, we try to cover one or two important ideals or religion that we feel like it's important to share with you all, and in this case, today's lecture will be centering around this idea of Buddhism. So before we introduce the concept of an ideal, we always try to talk about its founding figures or a few figures that led to the idea's rise, and in this case, the founding figure of Buddhism would be Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. So the Buddha was given birth in 567 BCE to the chief of the Shakya tribe, and because he was son of the chief, he was also known as the prince and was ultimately given a pretty high social status inside Indian society. And hence, because of this high social status, the Buddha was pretty much shielded and protected from outside society in the sense that his father kept him inside a castle with pretty much anything anyone could desire, all the way until he was an adult. And because of this type of sense of imprisonment, the Buddha was always really curious as to what was there outside in the actual human world. Then one day, when the Buddha eventually grew old enough to be able to roam the Indian streets himself, he saw three things. He saw a sick man, he saw an old man, and he saw a dead man. Now, he asked his charioteer, which is the person who rode his chariot, he asked him what were these three things, and then he was later introduced to the concepts of sickness, old age, and death. So being forever introduced to the sufferings of human life, the Buddha was extremely troubled as to what these sufferings had meanings or implications for in human life. Therefore, he traded in all of his royal and his luxuries, his status, to become a person who went outside to investigate what the way of life is. After investigating several philosophical ideas such as materialism or idealism, the Buddha later eventually settled on this idea that the core of human life is to become an eternal peace and become an eternal being along with the universe. This core value of this idea would later be developed by Buddha into what we know today as Buddhism. So, another figure we have to talk about when talking about Buddhism is Ashoka. Ashoka was a warring king in around the 300 BC period, and his role and participation inside Buddhism was less about what Buddhism actually was about and what the idea encouraged for, but instead Ashoka was a figure that really took part in the spread and the popularization of Buddhism. So in the early stages of his reign, Ashoka was known as a pretty violent leader in the sense that he took on multiple conquests and wars to make sure that he expanded his empire. But at a certain point, the killings and the pains and the strugglings of his people eventually really took to Ashoka and troubled him. Alright, is struggling even a word? This sense of troubling eventually really went to Ashoka, and then he denounced all type of violence in his kingdom in the sense that no one can kill anything and pretty much people were encouraged to become vegan. And also, addition to this, Ashoka also became a supporter or patron as we know today for Buddhism. So Ashoka, he himself didn't just live up to the ideals of Buddhism, but also he sent missionaries all around the world, most notably Sri Lanka, Greece, and Syria, to make sure that the ideals of Buddhism was spread. In addition, Ashoka also built monasteries and wrote edicts wherever he visited, and then tried to make sure that the ideals of Buddhism was reinforced pretty much all around the world. So, what really is Buddhism? Note from the start of this lecture that eventually Buddhism, which has been an idea that existed for thousands and thousands of years, that it has evolved into multiple different versions of Buddhism. So in this lecture, it will be pretty hard to try and define any specific type of Buddhism, but we will try to just go for the broad picture as to what Buddhism itself as a religion tried to advocate for in the broader sense. So first, Buddhism was thought of as an atheist religion in the sense that there was no god or supreme being. Even the Buddha himself is not worshipped as a holy being, but instead just as a great person who once lived to the ideals of Buddhism. Instead, it is in Buddhist belief that having a supreme being is bad because itself is a distraction for people to achieve the sense of enlightenment or nirvana. Now, second, one of the most key concepts of Buddhism comes from what we call the Four Noble Truths, and there are four noble truths. The first Four Noble Truth is the truth of suffering, which means that humans must be able to recognize that they're suffering in their life. And the second noble truth is this idea of the cause of suffering, where humans have to go inside and think about what is causing their suffering. And the Buddha offered a pretty easy explanation in the sense that the cause of human suffering is that humans always desire things that they cannot attain. For example, I want a Lamborghini, I want to live in a huge mansion, but these are things I probably would not attain in my life. Therefore, this lack of attainment would be the cause of why I'm miserable. And now the third noble truth, which is the end of suffering, is that humans must recognize that there is an end to the suffering. For example, the removal of all of your desires would be a good way to end all of the suffering that Buddha talks about. And the fourth noble truth is the path that frees us. This is pretty much will be elaborated later with the Eightfold Paths, but what the path that frees us essentially talks about is that it's offered different ways that humans can take or things that humans can do in order to make sure that we remove all of our desires and then actually become one with the universe. So the last big concept of Buddhism comes from this idea of the Eightfold Paths. Like I said before, it's more of an elaboration as to what the path that frees us talks about. It's 8 key values that Buddhism wants to make sure its followers remember, so for then people can actually attain enlightenment. So these Eightfold Paths are, sorry that I'm not able to memorize this, but it's the right view, the right resolve, the right speech, the right conduct, the right livelihood, the right effort, the right mindfulness, and the right meditation. These words sound pretty self-explanatory. It'll just take some time for you to think about yourself, but these are the 8 ways that the Buddha that kind of advocated for its followers to make sure that they reach nirvana, or also known as enlightenment. For me personally, I don't take these values as in like rules for life, because Buddhism is an ideology for what you should do yourself, and you should decide what you want to do yourself. And I would just see this as guidelines or just recommendations or just things to keep in the back of your head as you try to live your life, and make sure that you keep the Buddha's suggestions in mind when you make different actions as well. So there are 3 key quotes that I found from the Buddha that I feel like is pretty interesting and I wanted to share about, but if you are pretty interested, just search up Buddha's teachings on Google. I'm sure there are multiple type of recommendations or really important material on there that can help you broaden your understanding on Buddhism. So the first quote reads, "There is nothing so disobedient as an undisciplined mind, and there is nothing so obedient as a disciplined mind." Now, this quote was really intriguing for me because the first time I read it, I was like, oh, I would definitely want to be a disciplined mind and I would definitely want to be obedient. But I guess the beauty of Buddhism itself as an ideology and the beauty of the way Buddha teaches people is that he always maintains a sense of mysticism inside the words he says, in the sense that people are able to create their own interpretations. So what really concerns me or really riddles me inside this quote is this idea of being obedient, because it's not really mutually exclusive that one has to be obedient and disciplined. What I would argue is instead that one should make sure they stay disciplined, however disobedient, because that was how the Buddha acted himself. He was disobedient to the social norms in India, the caste system, which was why he was able to create a revolutionary ideal of Buddhism. So what I would say is to remain disciplined yet disobedient, because who knows, maybe nirvana doesn't even exist. The second quote reads, "There is no fear for one whose mind is not filled with desires." Now this is a really interesting quote because it's essentially saying that one cannot lose anything if one doesn't have anything. This is really interesting because it aligns with the ideal that Buddhism talks about in the sense that one should remove all of their desires. But if you take a step further and think about how this applies to our modern day society, must it be mutually exclusive that one can own material wealth yet be spiritually detached from society? because the Buddha himself did actually give up all of his material wealth and his social status to try and earn this idea of enlightenment. But is that really true? Can one become or achieve nirvana and be enlightened even with material wealth? The last quote that I came up with was, "Do not look for sanctuary in anyone except yourself." Now, this quote was eerily similar to something else I read in Marcus Aurelius' book, Meditation, which is a great book, by the way. 1010 would definitely recommend. In Marcus Aurelius' Meditation, he says, "People try to get away from it all, to the country, to the beach, to the mountains. You always wish that you could too. But this is idiotic. You can get away from it anytime you like, by going within. Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul." I really like this quote and this idea that both Marcus Aurelius and the Buddha advocates for, because it talks about the beauty of the religions that both Stoicism and Buddhism advocates for religion being for everybody. You don't have to be of a certain social rank to be able to be part of a religion, as long as you're willing to go deep inside your soul and then achieve inner peace, you're able to become a Buddhist. And this is also advice I take to my heart, because while no matter how busy your day is or how stressed you are, you need to make sure that you always take some time to just focus on yourself, sit down and then just think about life, or just think about nothing at all. Just make sure you have that self-care, I guess, as what modern society would call it. Oh gosh, I sound old. So how does Buddhism really connect with Western values? One of the biggest appeals that Buddhism would have, and what led to its popularity, I would say, is that this idea of anybody can be participating inside Buddhism. This was really contrasting to its context, considering that the Buddha came from the society of ancient India, where there was still a caste system of really solid social hierarchies, and people pretty much was just in one occupation their entire life. This also became a really big appeal in Western society as well, considering that in Buddhism, you were not forced to go to church, nor was there a Vatican church asking you for money for indulgences. And because of this type of, you don't really need anything to become a Buddhist, you can just find enlightenment yourself. This was a really popular appeal that made a lot of people want to become Buddhist. And another really interesting connection that I myself did not think of before researching this topic was that Buddhism actually really connects with our boy Nietzsche, which is one of the most famous philosophers of all time, and this ideal he created known as nihilism. And this connection that Nietzsche made between nihilism and this whole idea of Buddhism was that people should focus on themselves and should not try to justify others as morally good or bad. Because as Nietzsche would say himself, Buddhism itself as a religion, like his famous work, would be beyond good and evil. And last but not least, I would just want to talk about, because this was a really surprising fact for me, but there's actually a lot more Western celebrities that are actually Buddhism than you would think of. For example, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Jennifer Lopez, Tiger Woods, Rosa Parks. It was actually pretty astonishing to just see how much has society been integrated, in the sense that Eastern ideals and cultures have been instilled inside Western worlds and vice versa. So I want to thank everybody for attending today's lectures, and we hope to see you in future videos.